Everyone in Block D knew the rule. Never challenge the Yard Kings. They owned the pull-up bar, they owned the record, and they owned the humiliation of anyone dumb enough to try. So when the new skinny black inmate walked outside, quiet, polite, bones poking through his shirt, the gang's leader smirked. "Hey, Twig," he shouted, slapping the bar with his palm. "You do push-ups? Or do you snap in half first?" The yard erupted in laughter. The new guy didn't laugh back. He just watched them. 3 massive inmates grunting and sweating through sloppy reps, barely hitting 12 before dropping down like heroes. Then he stepped forward, voice soft, almost apologetic. Would you mind if I tried?" The yard went silent for a full second, then exploded with laughter again. "Yeah, man, go ahead. Let's see if you can do one." He reached for the bar, and the moment his fingers wrapped around the steel, something in the yard shifted. His shoulders locked, his breathing slowed, his feet left the ground, and he didn't stop. Not at 10, not at 20, not at 40. By the time he hit 73 flawless pull-ups, the laughter had died. The bully's jaws hung open, and the entire yard stared at him like they were witnessing something impossible. Because the skinny weakling they mocked wasn't weak at all. He was a former calisthenics competitor, a man whose life depended on perfect control, endurance, and mastering his own body in ways those bullies could never imagine. And today, they learned the hard way that strength isn't always loud. Stay with me until the end, because what happens after he destroys their record turns the entire yard upside down. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Marcus Thompson had been in Riverside Correctional for exactly 14 days when he first witnessed the Yard King's daily ritual. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, right after the second count, the same 3 inmates would swagger out to the exercise yard like they owned every square inch of concrete and steel. Big Mike led the pack. 6'4", 260 pounds of pure intimidation wrapped in prison blues. His arms were thick as telephone poles, covered in tattoos that told the story of a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. Behind him walked Diesel, nearly as large but meaner, with dead eyes that had seen too much violence to count. And finally, there was Tank, the youngest of the 3 but built like his nickname suggested, solid muscle from head to toe. These weren't just inmates. They were the unofficial rulers of Block D, the kind of men who decided who ate where, who spoke when, and who dared to even look in their direction. The guards knew it, the other prisoners knew it, and most importantly, everyone respected it. Their domain was a simple pull-up bar welded between 2 support poles in the corner of the yard. Nothing fancy, just cold steel that had witnessed countless attempts and countless failures. The bar had become more than exercise equipment. It was a throne, a symbol of power, and a reminder that in this place, physical strength meant everything. Every day, the 3 would take turns demonstrating their dominance. Big Mike would go first, his massive frame pulling upward with brute force, each rep accompanied by a grunt that echoed across the yard. Diesel followed with his own display, slower but more controlled, making sure everyone could see the definition in his shoulders and back. Tank finished the show with explosive movements that looked more like controlled violence than exercise. Their record was simple but intimidating. Big Mike held the yard title at 28 consecutive pull-ups, a number that had stood unchallenged for over 2 years. It wasn't just about the count. It was about what those numbers represented. Power, respect, and the unspoken understanding that nobody else even belonged in the same conversation. Marcus had watched this ritual every day since his arrival, always from the same spot near the basketball court, always keeping his distance. He understood the rules without anyone having to explain them. This wasn't his world, these weren't his people, and that definitely wasn't his bar. But Marcus carried secrets that nobody in Riverside Correctional could have imagined. 3 years earlier, before the arrest that changed everything, Marcus had been known by a completely different name in completely different circles. In the underground calisthenics community of Detroit, he was simply called Wire because of his lean frame and incredible tensile strength. While other competitors focused on building mass, Marcus had discovered something more powerful: the perfect balance between weight, technique, and endurance. He had spent 5 years training in abandoned warehouses and empty lots, perfecting movements that most people couldn't even pronounce: muscle-ups, human flags, one-armed handstand push-ups, and pull-ups that seemed to defy gravity itself. His training partners were former gymnasts, military veterans, and athletes who had dedicated their lives to mastering bodyweight movements. The competitions were underground events held in converted garages and industrial spaces, where men and women pushed the limits of what the human body could achieve without weights, machines, or supplements. Just flesh, bone, and willpower against the laws of physics. Marcus had never lost a pull-up competition. Not once. His personal best was 147 consecutive repetitions, a number that had earned him respect in circles that most people never knew existed. But more than the numbers, it was his technique that set him apart. While others relied on momentum and jerky movements, Marcus moved with mechanical precision, each rep identical to the last, his breathing controlled, his form flawless. The arrest had ended, all of that. A case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying something that belonged to someone else, and a public defender who barely knew his name. 3 to 5 years in Riverside Correctional, where his athletic achievements meant nothing, and his reputation was non-existent. So Marcus kept quiet, kept his head down, and tried to serve his time without incident. He did his push-ups in his cell, practiced his breathing exercises in the shower, and maintained his flexibility through subtle stretches during yard time. But he never touched the pull-up bar. That belonged to the Yard Kings, and Marcus understood the consequences of disrespecting that boundary. The other inmates had sized him up quickly and dismissed him just as fast. At 5'10" and 160 pounds, Marcus looked like exactly what everyone assumed he was: another small-time offender who would keep quiet, follow orders, and hopefully make it through his sentence without getting hurt. They saw his polite demeanor as weakness. They interpreted his silence as fear. When he said "yes, sir" to the guards and "excuse me" when passing other inmates, they assumed he was just another scared fish trying to swim in dangerous waters. What they didn't see was the way Marcus analyzed everything around him, how he studied the movements of every inmate in the yard, cataloging their strengths, weaknesses, and fighting styles, how he observed the guards' patrol patterns and noted the blind spots in their surveillance, how he measured distances, calculated angles, and assessed every piece of equipment as a potential training tool. Most importantly, they didn't see how Marcus watched the Yard Kings during their daily demonstrations, not with fear or admiration, but with the critical eye of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He could see the inefficiencies in their form, the wasted energy in their movements, the way they relied on pure strength rather than technique. Big Mike's pull-ups were impressive for their raw power, but his grip was too wide, and his range of motion incomplete. Diesel had better form, but telegraphed his fatigue through changes in his breathing pattern. Tank was explosive but burned out quickly because he didn't understand energy conservation. Marcus had spent years competing against men who could have easily outmatched any of the Yard Kings, athletes who combined size, strength, and technique in ways that redefined human potential. He had learned from coaches who understood biomechanics at a level that turned exercise into science. But none of that mattered in Block D. Here, reputation was everything. Respect was earned through intimidation, and challenging the established order was a mistake that could cost you everything. At least that's what Marcus believed until the afternoon when everything changed. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, suffocating Tuesday that made every inmate in Block D feel like the walls were closing in just a little tighter. The afternoon count had finished. The guards had retreated to their posts, and the usual tension that filled the yard every day was crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Marcus had been sitting on the concrete bleachers, reading a worn paperback novel that someone had left behind, when he heard Big Mike's voice boom across the exercise area. The man was holding court again, surrounded by his usual audience of admirers and wannabes who hung on his every word like he was dispensing wisdom from on high. "See, what y'all don't understand," Big Mike was saying, flexing his massive arms as he spoke, "is that this bar right here separates the men from the boys. Most of these fools in here couldn't do 5 good reps if their commissary depended on it." The crowd laughed on cue, a nervous sound that carried equal parts amusement and fear. Everyone knew that Big Mike's demonstrations weren't just about fitness. They were about establishing dominance, reminding everyone exactly where they stood in the rigid hierarchy that governed life in Block D. Diesel cracked his knuckles and stepped forward, his dead eyes scanning the assembled inmates like a predator sizing up potential prey. "Remember that punk from Cell Block C who thought he could show us up last month? What was his name again?" "Rodriguez," Tank answered with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Dude thought because he did some CrossFit on the outside that he could hang with us. Managed 8 pull-ups before his arms gave out. Haven't seen him in the yard since." The story wasn't new, but it served its purpose. Everyone remembered Rodriguez, a stocky former construction worker who had made the mistake of suggesting that the Yard King's form could use some work. After his public humiliation at the pull-up bar, he had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you overestimated your abilities and underestimated the consequences. Marcus turned a page in his book, trying to stay invisible, but his mind was analyzing everything he heard. Rodriguez's 8 repetitions suggested decent upper body strength, but poor endurance conditioning. The fact that he had been a CrossFit enthusiast meant he probably relied too heavily on momentum and didn't understand the subtle mechanics of efficient pull-up technique. Big Mike grabbed the bar with both hands, his grip so wide that his arms formed a perfect V-shape. "Y'all watch and learn," he announced, then began his demonstration. His first few reps were smooth and powerful, his massive frame rising and falling with mechanical precision. The crowd counted along enthusiastically. 5, 6, 7. By the 10th repetition, Big Mike's breathing had become audible. By the 15th, small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. At 20, his movements had slowed noticeably, and Marcus could see the telltale signs of muscle fatigue beginning to set in. 25, 26, 27. The 28th pull-up was a struggle. Big Mike's face contorted with effort, his legs swinging slightly as he fought to clear the bar one final time. When he finally lowered himself to the ground, the yard erupted in cheers and applause. 28, someone shouted. "Still the champ." Big Mike wiped sweat from his brow and smiled, but Marcus could see that the effort had cost him more than he wanted to admit. His breathing was labored, his arms were shaking slightly, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested he was closer to his absolute limit than anyone realized. Diesel took his turn next, managing a respectable 22 repetitions with better form than his leader, but less raw power. Tank followed with 19 explosive reps that looked impressive, but burned through his energy reserves too quickly. The demonstration was over, but the message was clear. These numbers weren't just personal bests. They were warnings, reminders that the Yard Kings operated on a level that ordinary inmates couldn't reach. Marcus closed his book and prepared to head back inside, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Big Mike kept flexing his arms, trying to hide the fact that they were still trembling from his effort. Maybe it was the forced quality of the laughter from the crowd, the way everyone seemed to be performing their admiration rather than feeling it. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of 14 days of watching this same ritual, this same display of dominance, that had begun to feel less impressive and more desperate. He found himself studying the pull-up bar with professional interest. The steel was solid, probably capable of supporting much more weight than it ever needed to. The height was standard, maybe 7.5 feet from the ground, requiring a small jump or boost to reach for someone of average height. The spacing between the support posts was adequate for proper form, with enough room to avoid hitting the sides during the full range of motion. But it was the technique he had just witnessed that really caught his attention. All three men had approached the exercise with brute force rather than efficiency. Their grips were too wide, their movements too explosive, their breathing patterns completely uncontrolled. They were strong, no question about that, but they were also wasting enormous amounts of energy with every repetition. Marcus had competed against men who could do 50 pull-ups with the same effort these three were putting into 20. The difference wasn't genetics or natural ability. It was knowledge, technique, and years of dedicated training that focused on efficiency rather than just raw power. A memory flashed through his mind, the underground competition in Detroit, where he had first broken the 100-rep barrier. His opponent had been a former Marine, 6'3" and 200 pounds of solid muscle. The man had looked at Marcus's lean frame and smirked, clearly expecting an easy victory. That Marine had managed 47 pull-ups, an impressive number by any standard, but Marcus had kept going. 60, 70, 80, 90. By the time he reached 100, the entire warehouse had gone silent. People were recording with their phones, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The Marine had approached him afterward, no longer smirking, his expression a mixture of respect and confusion. "How?" he had asked. "I've been training for 15 years. I can bench press 300 pounds. How did you make that look so easy?" Marcus had tried to explain about breathing patterns, about energy conservation, about the difference between strength and endurance. But the real answer was simpler and more complex than any technical discussion could capture. He had found his calling, his art, his way of turning his body into something that transcended its apparent limitations. Now, standing in the yard at Riverside Correctional, watching Big Mike bask in the applause for his 28 repetitions, Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he had tried to keep buried since his arrest. It wasn't pride or ego or the need to prove himself. It was something deeper, something that connected to who he had been before this place, before the mistakes that had landed him here. The crowd was beginning to disperse, the daily ritual complete. Big Mike was still flexing and joking, but Marcus could see the relief in his eyes. Another day, another successful demonstration of dominance, another 24 hours of maintaining his position at the top of the yard hierarchy. But as the inmates began filtering back toward the cell blocks, Marcus remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the pull-up bar. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the concrete, and for just a moment, the yard was quiet except for the distant sound of guards talking and the constant hum of the prison's ventilation system. Something was building inside him, a pressure that had been accumulating for 14 days of silence, of keeping his head down, of pretending to be something he wasn't. Marcus had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of controlled explosion, of channeling every ounce of energy and focus into moments of pure physical expression. He took a step toward the pull-up bar, then stopped. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings about consequences, about the unwritten rules that govern this place, about the price of challenging the established order. But another part of him, the part that had once been known as Wire in the underground competitions of Detroit, was whispering something different. It was reminding him that strength wasn't always about size, that technique could overcome brute force, and that sometimes the most powerful statement you could make was the quiet demonstration of what was actually possible. The yard was almost empty now, just a few stragglers finishing their conversations, a couple of guards making their rounds, and Marcus standing 30 feet away from a piece of steel that had become the symbol of everything he wasn't supposed to challenge. He looked around one more time, making sure that Big Mike and his crew had disappeared into the cell block. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but something inside him had shifted during those few minutes of watching the Yard Kings perform their daily ritual. For 14 days, Marcus had been playing a role, pretending to be weak, submissive, invisible. He had convinced himself that it was the smart play, the safe strategy for surviving his sentence without incident. But as he stood there in the fading afternoon light, staring at that pull-up bar, Marcus realized that he had been lying to himself about more than just his physical capabilities. He had been lying about who he was, what he stood for, and what he was willing to accept. Tomorrow was Wednesday, and Wednesday was about to become very different from Tuesday. Wednesday arrived with the same suffocating gray sky, but something felt different in Block D. Marcus had barely slept, his mind replaying the previous day's events over and over. The way Big Mike's arms had trembled after 28 reps, the forced laughter from the crowd, the desperate edge beneath all that bravado. He went through his morning routine mechanically. Breakfast in the cafeteria, where conversations died whenever he walked past. The Yard Kings held court at their usual table, Big Mike's voice booming across the room as he told stories that everyone had heard a dozen times before. So there I was, bench pressing 4 plates while this punk trainer tried to tell me my form was wrong. Big Mike laughed, his audience hanging on every word. I said, "Man, when you can move real weight, then you can talk to me about form." Marcus stirred his oatmeal and listened, noting the subtle changes in the dynamic since yesterday. Tank seemed more aggressive, making comments about respect and knowing your place. Diesel kept scanning the room with those dead eyes, like he was looking for trouble before it found him. They were feeling threatened, Marcus realized. Not by anything specific, but by the general sense that their authority wasn't as absolute as it had seemed. Prison was like that. Power was fluid, constantly shifting based on perception and fear. The slightest crack in the foundation could bring down entire hierarchies. After breakfast came work detail. Marcus had been assigned to the laundry, a steamy basement operation where inmates fed industrial washing machines and tried to stay invisible. The supervisor, a tired-looking guard named Officer Williams, barely paid attention as long as the work got done. Marcus folded prison uniforms with mechanical precision, his mind elsewhere. He was thinking about breathing patterns, about the rhythm of efficient movement, about the way his body had felt during those underground competitions in Detroit. There was a meditation to it, a Zen-like state where technique became instinct and endurance became effortless. His cellmate, a quiet man named Torres who was serving time for tax evasion, had noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor. "You all right, man? You seem different today." Marcus looked up from the laundry basket. Torres was one of the few inmates who minded his own business, did his time quietly, and avoided the prison politics that consumed most of the population. They had developed a respectful but distant relationship over the past 2 weeks. "Just thinking," Marcus replied, continuing to fold, "about what I used to be before this place." Torres nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes I dream about my accounting office. Boring as hell. But it was mine, you know? Had my name on the door and everything." The conversation drifted to safer topics, but Marcus could feel something building inside him, a pressure that had been accumulating since his first day in Block D. He had spent 2 weeks being someone he wasn't, accepting a role that felt like wearing clothes 3 sizes too small. Lunch came and went. The afternoon count was completed. And then, at exactly 3 o'clock, the cell block doors opened for yard time. Marcus walked outside with the usual crowd, but today he didn't head for his normal spot near the basketball court. Instead, he found himself drifting toward the exercise area, drawn by an invisible force that he couldn't quite name. The Yard Kings were already there, of course. Big Mike was stretching his massive arms, preparing for another demonstration of dominance. Diesel was doing practice reps on a lower bar, his movements sharp and controlled. Tank was psyching himself up, slapping his chest and muttering under his breath. A crowd was gathering, the same faces that showed up every day to witness the ritual. Some genuinely admired the Yard Kings' strength. Others were simply afraid to be anywhere else. All of them understood their role in the daily performance that kept the prison's power structure intact. Marcus positioned himself at the edge of the group, close enough to see everything but far enough away to avoid attention. His heart was beating faster than normal, and he could feel that familiar pre-competition energy starting to build in his chest. Big Mike grabbed the bar and began his demonstration. The crowd counted along enthusiastically, their voices echoing off the concrete walls that surrounded the yard. 15, 16, 17. But Marcus wasn't watching Big Mike anymore. His attention had shifted to the bar itself, analyzing the setup with professional interest. The grip spacing, the height, the way the afternoon light cast shadows that would affect depth perception. He was unconsciously preparing, even though he hadn't made any conscious decision about what he was going to do. 25, 26, 27, 28. Big Mike dropped to the ground, breathing heavily but grinning with satisfaction. The crowd erupted in applause, the same enthusiastic response they delivered every day. But Marcus noticed something different in the cheers. They seemed forced, obligatory, like everyone was going through the motions of being impressed. Diesel took his turn next, managing 24 reps with his characteristic controlled aggression. The crowd counted along, but their energy was already flagging. Tank followed with 21 explosive repetitions that looked impressive, but lacked the technical precision that Marcus's trained eye could appreciate. As the demonstration wound down, Marcus felt himself taking a step forward, then another. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings, reminding him about consequences in prison politics and the price of challenging established authority. But something deeper was driving him now, something connected to who he had been before the arrest, before the mistakes that had landed him in this place. For 2 weeks, he had been playing the role of the weak, submissive inmate who knew his place and stayed in his lane. The problem was, that wasn't who Marcus Thompson really was. The crowd was beginning to disperse when Marcus's voice cut through the general conversation. It was quiet, almost apologetic, but it carried clearly across the exercise area. "Excuse me, would you mind if I tried?" The effect was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in his direction. The Yard Kings, who had been basking in their usual post-demonstration glory, suddenly looked like they had been slapped. Big Mike was the first to recover, his face shifting from confusion to amusement to something darker. "What did you say, Twig?" Marcus felt every eye in the yard focused on him, but his voice remained steady. "I asked if you would mind if I tried the pull-up bar, just to see how many I can do." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Tank started laughing, a harsh sound that was quickly picked up by others in the crowd. But Marcus noticed that not everyone was laughing. Some inmates were watching with genuine curiosity, wondering what would happen next. "Boy, you better sit your skinny ass down before you embarrass yourself," Diesel growled, his dead eyes fixed on Marcus like a predator sizing up prey. "This ain't no game we're playing out here." Big Mike held up a hand, silencing his lieutenant. His expression had shifted again, this time to something that looked almost paternal. "Look, little man, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this bar ain't for everyone. Why don't you stick to push-ups or jumping jacks or something more your speed?" The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus could feel the weight of 200 eyes watching him, waiting to see if he would back down, apologize, and slink away like Rodriguez had done a month ago. Instead, he took another step forward. "I understand this is your space," Marcus said, his voice still respectful but carrying a new note of quiet confidence. "I'm not trying to disrespect anyone or cause trouble. I just want to see what I can do." Tank stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. You want to see what you can do? You can do exactly what we tell you to do when we tell you to do it. That's how this works in here. But Big Mike was studying Marcus more carefully now, his expression thoughtful. There was something in the smaller man's posture, in the way he held himself, that didn't match his submissive reputation. It was subtle, but Big Mike had spent enough years in prison to recognize confidence when he saw it, even when it was wrapped in politeness. You ever done pull-ups before, Twig? Big Mike asked, his tone shifting to something more neutral. Marcus nodded. A few. The understatement hung in the air like a challenge. A few pull-ups could mean anything from 3 to 30, but there was something in the way Marcus said it that suggested he wasn't talking about casual exercise. Officer Williams had noticed the commotion and was walking over, his hand resting casually on his radio. Prison guards were trained to spot potential trouble before it escalated, and a crowd gathered around the exercise equipment usually meant someone was about to do something stupid. "Everything all right over here?" Williams called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had broken up more prison confrontations than he could count. Big Mike glanced at the approaching guard, then back at Marcus. The last thing he wanted was official attention, especially if this situation spiraled out of control. But backing down in front of the entire yard would be almost as damaging to his reputation as losing a physical confrontation. "Just having a friendly conversation about fitness, Officer Williams," Big Mike replied, his voice carefully neutral. "New fish here wants to try some pull-ups." Williams looked skeptical. He had been working at Riverside Correctional for 8 years, and he had never seen a friendly conversation about exercise that drew this kind of crowd. But as long as nobody was throwing punches or brandishing weapons, he was inclined to let the inmates work things out themselves. "Keep it friendly," Williams warned, then continued his patrol. The moment the guard was out of earshot, the tension ratcheted up several notches. Tank was practically vibrating with aggressive energy, while Diesel maintained his predatory stillness. Big Mike seemed torn between amusement and genuine curiosity about what this skinny inmate thought he could accomplish. Marcus looked around the circle of faces surrounding him. Some were hostile, others were curious, but all of them were waiting to see what would happen next. He had crossed a line by challenging the established order, and there was no going back now. The pull-up bar hung there like a judgment, 8 feet of steel that had witnessed countless attempts and countless failures. In the fading afternoon light, it looked both inviting and intimidating, a simple piece of equipment that had become something much more significant. Marcus walked toward the bar, his movement triggering a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. He could hear whispered conversations, side bets being placed, predictions about how quickly he would fail and what the consequences would be. But as he approached the steel bar that had become the symbol of power in Block D, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 weeks of prison life. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like himself again. Wednesday afternoon at Riverside Correctional became the day when everything changed in Block D. Marcus reached for the bar with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a pull-up competition in his life. His fingers wrapped around the steel, and in that moment, every assumption about weakness and strength was about to be shattered. The crowd expected failure. They got a masterclass in human potential instead. Marcus began his ascent with mechanical precision that made the Yard King's earlier attempts look like amateur hour. His breathing was controlled, his form was flawless, and his pace was steady as a metronome. 10 repetitions passed like warm-up exercises. 20 felt effortless. By 30, the laughter had died completely. Big Mike's face went from amusement to confusion to something approaching fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. The natural order of things was being violated right in front of his eyes. At 50 pull-ups, Marcus looked like he was just getting started. His technique was poetry in motion, each repetition identical to the last, his lean frame moving with an efficiency that defied every assumption about size and strength. The crowd had gone completely silent, watching something they couldn't quite believe. Diesel stepped closer, his dead eyes wide with disbelief. Tank's cocky grin had vanished entirely, replaced by the stunned expression of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. 60 repetitions. 70. The numbers kept climbing, and Marcus showed no signs of fatigue. His breathing remained controlled, his form stayed perfect, and his pace never wavered. This wasn't just about breaking a record anymore. This was about redefining what was possible. At 73 pull-ups, Marcus had obliterated Big Mike's record by more than double. But he didn't stop. 80, 90, 100. The crowd was no longer just silent. They were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. When Marcus finally lowered himself to the ground, after 112 flawless repetitions, the yard erupted in a sound that had never been heard in Block D before. It wasn't just cheering. It was the sound of a power structure crumbling and rebuilding itself in real time. Big Mike approached Marcus, but there was no aggression in his movement now, just respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, no longer hostile but filled with genuine awe. "Detroit Underground competitions," he replied simply. "I was never the biggest guy in the room, but I learned that strength isn't about size. It's about technique, endurance, and never accepting other people's limitations as your own." The Yard King's reign was over, not through violence or intimidation, but through the quiet demonstration of what true strength looked like. Marcus had proven that the most powerful statement you could make wasn't the loudest one. It was the one that spoke through actions rather than words. That evening, as word spread through the cell blocks about what had happened in the yard, Marcus Thompson earned something more valuable than fear or respect. He earned the right to be himself again. And sometimes, that's the only victory that really matters. Remember, strength isn't always what it appears to be. The next time someone underestimates you based on appearances, think about Marcus Thompson and his quiet question that changed everything. Until then, never let anyone else define what you're capable of achieving.